Well, welcome everybody. We're going to wait. I'm going to wait just another minute or two for some more people to sign in, and we'll get started. All of you are healthy and staying well, and I'm in self-isolation at home, like so many people here. And our dental school is closed except for absolute emergency care. And all of our courses are online, as I know many of you are. And so that calls for us to take a look at some different ways of managing things. And that's what I would like to do today is talk to you and show you the demonstration of how we could use the 3D tooth atlas. So let's start by acquainting all of you with the atlas, because I assume some of you have not seen the tooth atlas before. It has 4 sections to it, and I'm going to first of all show the different sections, kind of give you an idea what's in there, and then I'll show you how I would suggest it could be used in some distance education or online courses. The first large section is called tooth morphology. And when you click on this, you have pictures of the primary and the secondary dentitions. So everything that somebody would need for pediatric dentistry anatomy is there. We won't talk about that today, but I'll show you the secondary dentition. You can mouse over any particular tooth. So if you were starting the course with a discussion of the maxillary central incisor, then what comes up is a picture of the tooth. Now, there are sections up here. You notice morphology, comparisons, rotation, slices, and I'll go through each of these. This section is an encyclopedia of information. It has everything that's ever been written about the morphology of teeth from all of the different textbooks and journal articles over the years. So it's really meant to be a resource for students to use, but also you as teachers can use it very effectively in class. For instance, this maxillary central incisor, you can click on any of these features because the list of features includes everything that's ever been described in the literature. So if you wanted to know about the incisal edge form, it will show that to you graphically, as well as show you the information as presented in different published sources. So you can click on any one of these areas and it will switch for you. Then you can go to a different view. So it's pretty much like an electronic textbook, but much more exhaustive because it shows you all the information published by different people, including information published by G.V. Black, the first textbooks in the 1800s. So that's the first section on morphology. Then, because comparisons is so important, to me, the 2 things that students need to learn are the comparisons of specific groups of teeth and the unique characteristics of teeth. And we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. So there's a comparison section following the same features we showed with the individual teeth that would allow a student to compare the maxillary, central, and lateral incisor from any particular view. Again, you click on that, it shows you all of the referenced information that would be present. Now, the real interesting part of the 3D tooth atlas lies in the 3D content, and it starts with rotations and slices, because here we have a picture of the tooth, a CT scan of a central incisor, and a radiograph. There's also a cross-sectional slider bar. So if you take the slider bar below the teeth, you can rotate the teeth around to whatever view. Gives you very interesting things to do in class. What I actually do is rotate this around and then ask the students, okay, what view are we looking at from this particular direction? And I'll show you in the program a little bit later where the first presentation would be, which is terminology. But I just wanted to familiarize you with this particular section. And then the cross-sectional slider shows you where the red line is located. And all of the literature in learning has showed that the students that have the greatest success in all of the sciences, that's the health sciences, chemistry, physics, doesn't matter, are the ones that have the best spatial abilities, the ability to visualize objects three-dimensionally. And that's really what we're trying to do with this particular course. And that takes us to the next section on 3D teeth. And in here, there is a stylized tooth, the so-called average tooth, that you can rotate around by putting your cursor on it, do whatever you want. And then there's a series, let me show you, there's a whole library of actual extracted teeth that have all sorts of interesting variations. And this is where you can have a great time with the students. So let's just take this first one. So there's a CT scan of a real tooth. And what you have the capability of doing is bringing out this little slider from the side. And then you can change the opacity. So I can change the opacity of the enamel so you could see the underlying dentin in this particular tooth. Now that has a very interesting application in operative dentistry and in prosthodontics, showing how you might layer a material to simulate a natural tooth. Then I can make the dentin partially transparent, and that shows the pulp. We also have the ability to turn these items completely off, so we're looking only at the pulp, and you can rotate those, at any of these stages, you can rotate this around and take a look at it. Some, but not all of these teeth are also annotated. So you could actually look at the mesial cervical line curvature. Let me make it opaque so it shows better for you. And then you can see that that would be visualized on the 3D tooth along with the referenced information. You also have the capability to draw on here. So this little brush at the bottom, if you click that and put it on in the on mode, you have the ability with your cursor to actually draw something. So you could draw something and ask a student to identify any anatomic landmark that you would want them to see. And of course, then you can clear that. We could rotate, let me clear that, turn this off, which I need to do before I rotate. And you can actually see up here, you could actually ask a student, okay, what is that we're seeing, that little red dot? I didn't draw it very correctly. So in class, online, you could actually look through these library of teeth. That's what you would need to do, and just see which ones would be of interest to you. Like I use quite a bit some other teeth, like there's one that obviously, let me clear this and turn this off, that obviously had a restoration in it that fell out. And there's a huge area over here on the side with something missing. So you can go down through these very interesting teeth. And for instance, like this one comes from a 91-year-old person. And so you can talk about what happened. Why is their dentin exposed here at the incisal edge? Now, why is the pulp no longer in the coronal portion of the tooth? So there's a lot of opportunities for clinical correlations with many of the disciplines of dentistry that can be used here, as well as helping the student to start getting a three-dimensional perspective as to what the tooth looks like. And then there's a series. So this is really, that's true for every tooth. Like for instance, if we went to the molar, you can see there's our stylized tooth. And there's a radiograph of a tooth that had a perforation in it. You know, this is all, there's all sorts of normal and abnormal situations here. Here's a situation with caries in the distal of this tooth, and you actually can see the pulp exposure if I were to turn this off. So within this huge library of hundreds of teeth, there's lots of opportunities for you to present and teach whatever it is that you wanted to do about the morphology of teeth. There also is in this encyclopedia a radiograph section. So here, if we happen to be on the molar, let's go back to the central incisor. Then there's a periapical radiograph that would show most of the anatomic features that you might want somebody to recognize on a periapical radiograph, and it's described for you, it's highlighted, so you can go through that. Same thing with a panoramic radiograph. Here we can outline the coronoid process, so you can basically teach some things radiographically about the teeth that would be part of a radiology course. There's a huge library of different teeth of all kinds of anomalies, and so let's see with this on the maxillary central incisor. I'm just going to scroll down here to see we've got 70 some different radiographic variations. So, and then there is a little simplistic quiz here that relates to whatever tooth you're on. In this case, it would be the maxillary incisors and central incisor. And so the question is, the incisocervical dimension of the crown is greater than its mesiodistal dimension. And so they can go through and it will score itself based on each of the particular questions. So that's a general overview of this encyclopedia that's a reference source, again, for students, as well as a resource in education that when you spend some time in there, you can find very interesting pictures and information in there that will be very helpful. Now I want to go back to our main menu, which is the little house up here. And the actual course, as I would teach it to students, lies in the Human Dentition Synopsis. So if you click on this, it brings you to 3 sections. There's an exhaustive section. When I say exhaustive, this really is a synopsis. It's a boiled down section of the most important information about primary tooth morphology, about secondary tooth morphology, and about secondary pulp morphology. So this meets pediatric dentistry, tooth morphology, the secondary dentition, and endodontics with pulp morphology. So I'm going to focus today just to show you the secondary tooth morphology. And herein lies what I consider to be a complete course for the students. This is the most important information that they would need to know to tackle any examination or part of a course. And we've chosen to divide that up by the different types of teeth: maxillary incisors, mandibular incisors, canines, premolars, and it goes all the way down to mandibular molars. So let's start with the maxillary incisors just to give you an idea. Now you can go through the different numbering systems used in different parts of the world. The arrow will change as you click on a different tooth number. And so we can then teach the different numbering systems that are used. After the numbering system is a next button, but I want to draw your attention to the top. We're right now in the principal morphologic comparison section. That's the key information that a student needs to know. The other key section is the unique characteristics that I'll come back to and talk about. So next, if we click on this, looking at the most important information, we'd like the student to know what's the big differences between a maxillary central and lateral incisor from a facial view. And the information that is here on the side, that was derived by looking at all the publications, beginning with G.V. Black down through time, and what characteristics have those particular textbooks or publications emphasized as being important in distinguishing those two teeth. So that's where this list came from. It's simply what has been out there as considered to be very important. So you could click on incisal edge form, and it shows a clinical picture as well as the drawing with the light highlighting on the drawing in this particular case. And it tells us the incisal edge is straighter mesiodistally on the central incisor. It's more curved on the lateral incisor. And some of these are saying the same thing. It's just we chose to put different wording in there because different authors emphasize things differently, and the wording is has slight variations to it. So the proximal incisal angles. And so you can go down through here. And what I personally do is assign the students, okay, the topic of today is going to be the maxillary incisors. I want you to go through this information that's in here and learn it all about the maxillary incisors. And then I give them a quiz at the beginning of the period over this particular material, including some of the pictures, because you can do a print the screen and you could take any one of these pictures, bring it up, and ask them a question about it. And then we go into a review and interactive session, which you could be doing relative to these particular topics. So that has the facial view. And the next view, as we would expect, would be the lingual view. Now, interestingly, in all the literature that I looked at, there were only 4 really key things from that lingual view. that a student would need to know about. So you can see the cingulum size and the discussion of that, the marginal ridge prominence, the lingual fossa depth, and this groove that sometimes appears on the lateral incisor. So this would be what the students would go through, and then I would have a review session with them. And that's at that point where you could put in some of your favorite material. You could switch from this to a PowerPoint and show them some of your favorite pictures or information that you're used to using in teaching the morphology. Then we come to a mesial view or proximal view, and then we can see there's only 3 characteristics here that have been emphasized as being extremely important. And of course, this cervical line curvature, the mesial cervical line has less curvature on the lateral incisor, and we'll come back to that in the unique characteristics section. And so you then go to the next, which would be the incisal view. And so now we have the views that have been emphasized in the published literature relative to the maxillary incisors. Now we can go back to the unique characteristics section. And in here, we see that for the maxillary central incisor, there are 4 unique characteristics, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And most of the examination questions, at least in the United States, that have appeared on national board examinations or different teachers have used in their education, have largely been comparisons and unique characteristics. So what would be a unique characteristic of mesiodistal and incisocervical crown dimension? Well, you can see the maxillary central incisor has the greatest mesiodistal dimension of any anterior tooth. So that was judged by those authors there to be a unique characteristic, and it's shown there graphically. And these make great questions for the students to respond to. So what would be the unique characteristic of comparing the mesiodistal and incisocervical crown dimensions? Well, the mesiodistal and incisocervical dimension of the maxillary central incisor are closer to each other than any other incisor, the mesiodistal and incisocervical, shown graphically. And then this has been a question on national board examinations and things that I've ever, for most of my career. The incisal curvature of the cervical line on the mesial surface of the maxillary central incisor exceeds that of any other tooth. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 authors have recognized that and emphasized it. So this serves as a great source for student learning as well as questions for you. Now, recognize that there is a unique characteristics quiz here. And so you come into this, there's 82 questions in here that a student could go over and review. And of course, I actually then take a lot of these same questions because I figure if a student knows 82 answers to 82 questions, that's great. What I don't want them to do is just simply be able to visually recognize a question and pick on the right answer. So you can flip the distractors around. You could slightly change the stem, but this is a great source for you to make up examination questions for the students, and they can prepare themselves ahead of time. Now, let's go back to our principal morphologic comparisons again, and let's just move down for fun. Let's go down to maxillary molars. And again, we have the arrow will show the different numbering systems just like before. And then we go to the next button, and that shows the comparison of the 3 maxillary molars from a facial view. Again, with all of the key characteristics that have been identified in the literature listed here, everything referenced for you. So you can go through that from facial view, lingual view with a clinical picture as well as a drawing, and an occlusal view, because in that situation, that's the ones that have been emphasized. Now, I also want to show you that there's a tooth characteristics multiple choice quiz, and you've got 100 questions here. And I'm going to come back to this tooth characteristics group quiz in just a minute after we look at a unique characteristics. So let's go to the unique characteristics, and we'll go down here to the maxillary first molars. And here would be a list of the unique characteristics. So again, students can study this ahead of time if you choose to do that. Have a quiz at the beginning of your online. They can check in, they can take the quiz online and be graded on that. You can then evaluate it. You can go over, review whatever it is that you like from this program, as well as your own material. And then again, we've got the unique characteristics quiz. Now, morphology up to this point has all been looking at, let's say, the central and lateral incisor in the maxilla, and we're looking at what characteristics do we use to distinguish between those two teeth. Now, I want to take you back here because this tooth characteristics group quiz is what I use as the end of the course review for the students. And this is a fabulous national board review, or if you have a national test that they have to take, or before they take the end of the course. And this has taken all of the characteristics, but it's flipped it around. Instead of looking at two teeth and comparing those two, this is the characteristics. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here's the tooth characteristics quiz. Which of these groups of teeth are compared using the characteristic that appears in the box below? So this starts out real simple. The outline form from a facial view. Can you tell the difference between a maxillary, central, and lateral incisor by looking at its outline form from a facial view? Well, yes, you can. So that shows you, yes, it tells you you're correct, and it shows you a picture along with the information. Can you tell the difference between a maxillary and mandibular canine? Well, of course we can. Shows you a picture. Same thing with the premolars. And of course, we know from all of these that in fact you can tell all of the groups of teeth that we looked at over in this left-hand column over here. We can tell all of that by looking at things from a facial view. So then you go to next. And this has outline form from an incisal view. Well, of course, you can tell central and lateral incisor, canines. But whoops, you can't tell a maxillary first and second premolar because there is no incisal view. That would have to say occlusal view. So they can go through all of this. And some of them are, incisal edge form. Well, obviously, some teeth don't have incisal edges, but central and lateral incisor do. Maxillary, mandibular canines do, premolars do not. And this goes on. There's 34 characteristics that I found by studying all of the groups of teeth, the maxillary incisors, mandibular incisors, canines, the maxillary mandibular premolars and molars. There's 34 characteristics that we use to distinguish between those. So you can go through this list, as you can see, presence of prominence of the lingual morphology, the mesiodistal dimension of the marginal ridges. And this requires a greater depth of understanding and knowledge on part of the student. So they go through the course individually, comparing the different groups of teeth. Then at the end, I do this review session where they now have to think about this and discuss it. And so it's a great opportunity for you to do the same on your online teaching, because you could ask the students, can you tell the difference between the maxillary, central, and lateral incisors based on the mesiodistal dimension of the marginal ridges? And so you'd say, well, yes, you can. And then it shows you the picture that indicates the central incisor, of course, has a greater mesiodistal dimension to that marginal ridge. So it's a great way of reviewing the individual comparisons as well as putting together the whole course at once. So that's the purpose of that particular section, as you can see. Now I want to go back here. Now this interactive dental anatomy course, I don't like this because it's actually got me as a shrunken head, but I need to show it to you so you can see what's in here. You choose a section and you can begin with terminology. This is actually, you could have the students review this to begin with. So let's just take a look at this terminology one. and see what we get.
It is important to understand the terminology used in tooth morphology so effective communication can occur as each tooth is studied. In humans, there are two sets of teeth. First, the primary teeth, also known as deciduous teeth, and some people even call them milk teeth.
So you can get the idea here. This can be given to the students, and of course, we have each student has a copy of this on their computer. It can be either a computer or a tablet. And then they go through this ahead of time. And that's the most effective way of using this. So you could assign that terminology ahead of time, and they would go through it. And that teaches them all the different teeth, their names, the numbering system, all the different surfaces and the names that we apply that can be very confusing to a student. So you can also then have a quiz on that particular item. Then you can go through each one of these particular sections. And this is actually a recording of me talking about the tooth. So a student could review this ahead of time, look at it. And when we've been teaching classes traditionally in the classroom, this would be helpful for students who missed the class or wanted to review. But online, then this can be very helpful. So if we clicked on this,
there are both maxillary and mandibular canines that we would like to be able to distinguish from each other. There's a left and right maxillary canine and the left and right mandibular canine. And they have some resemblance, but yet some very unique characteristics that help us to distinguish between the two teeth. And let's begin with the crown dimensions. If you look at the clinical picture on the left, you see the maxillary canine and on the top and the mandibular canine on the right. And you can see a very distinct difference. Which one of these teeth has a greater mesiodistal crown dimension?
And what happens here, this goes along to a certain point. I ask a question, and then the student needs to answer that question based on the picture that they say, and then they can advance forward. So if they think it's the mandibular canine that has a greater mesiodistal dimension, sorry, they get it wrong. And then when they get it right,
Which one of
now
these
it
teeth
continues.
has the greater incisocervical crown dimension?
And then they have to look at the picture. So again, this is emphasizing all the comparisons that were in the previous section, but it's in a recorded way that they can then review what I've considered to be an important aspect of it. So they have to look incisocervical crown dimension, and they have to know.
So if we look at the arrows that have now been superimposed over the teeth, you can see that the maxillary canine has a greater mesiodistal dimension, but a shorter incisocervical dimension. So the mandibular canine has the taller crown. The next interesting aspect of the canines, because these are the only anterior teeth that have a cusp or a cusp tip, the pointed projection is sort of in the center of the tooth. And if you look at those, there's a difference between the sharpness of the cusp tips. So which one of these teeth has a sharper cusp tip, that is, projects higher above the proximal portion of the tooth?
So I think you get the idea of how this would function and could be very useful for students to review. And then again, you on your online portion could go over these different things. It's also got the questions in here that would be helpful for you in making an examination. And self-assessment, you can see there's questions in here that they would have to answer relative to this. And there's so many hundreds of questions in here that you could basically pick a series of the questions right out of here and make up your examination. If they knew all of this and you just rearrange things a little bit, put in your own favorite questions along with them, you've got your examinations all ready to go. So that's how this third section functions. Now, I do want to go back here and show you another unique aspect of this, because there's a self-assessment examination in the synopsis section. So when you click on this, you have the opportunity to select any one of the groups of teeth that we already talked about, the maxillary incisors, or you could select all of them. And this would be something like you would do at the end of a course. And I actually use this very extensively and have the students go through it. And I tell them, you're going to see some of these same pictures on a quiz and an examination, and you're going to have to be able to identify it. So let's start this quiz. And some of these are not real easy, I can tell you. So the first thing that happens here is a picture pops up, and this is random. They never come up in the same order. And they have to look at that tooth and they have to decide, first of all, which category does this tooth belong to? So if they think that's a canine, it isn't going to work. If they figure eventually that it's a maxillary molar, then they get it correct. And this keeps track of the score for them. And then they can get advice if they're not sure whether that's a first, second, or third molar. They can go in here and they can look at different characteristics of it from different, like for instance, facial cusp equality. And this gives them some clues that they could go to. And then eventually they have to identify it. And they'll have to say it's a left first molar. And they have to start then looking at the picture and getting their 3D perspective. And I tell the students, take the tooth out of the picture, extract the tooth from the picture and put it into your own head. Where does it fit best? And they can have some interesting experiences with that, starting to get their three-dimensional or spatial abilities worked out. So let's say we think that's a right second molar. What if it's a right first molar? What if it's a left second molar? There we go. So finally, if they get it correct, then it's told them, and it has the numbering system that they're correct. And then they go to the next one, and that would be a picture of an extracted tooth. So you can see the theory here. And then you can do a print to screen here, and any one of those pictures can appear as the quiz or part of the examination in here, making this a great resource for you. There's an incisal view of mandibular incisors, and they have to recognize that that's a central incisor and not and the lateral incisor next to it has that incisal edge twisted on the tooth and is not perpendicular, whereas this one, the incisal edge is perpendicular to the tooth. And those are the type of things that I would be reviewing with them in class to tell them, to help them to understand, how did I know that that was a central incisor? And then there's a maxillary second premolar, which is, again, a difficult rascal to figure out whether it's left or right, but it can be done. And a view of a mandibular tooth, which we assume is a canine. So let's see if I got lucky. I got lucky. And then you can get your advice, or you can go directly to identify it. And then they have to start looking at that, and they have to figure out that this is a proximal view. And is it a mesial view or is it a distal view? And then they have to start studying things. So I would say, how would you tell the difference between a mesial and distal view of a mandibular canine when you can't see both of the views? Well, I said, well, one of the things, you could look at the incisal edge and you could see how much of the incisal edge is visible from a proximal view. If you have a lot of it visible, that means there's a downward slope to that incisal edge, whereas this one doesn't have too much visible. So I might guess that this would be a mesial view. And if that's the case, then we would say it's a mandibular right canine. And I got lucky again, and I can mess up some of these in class, believe me, because some of them are pretty difficult to do. So we've got all of these different views of all kinds of teeth. There's 453 either pictures of drawings or extracted teeth or clinical pictures. So this becomes a great source of online education and self-assessment from the standpoint of the students. Now, there's quizzes and specialized resources. And what we've done here is put all of the examinations together in one location, except for that tooth characteristics quiz that's for the end of the course. It just accidentally got left off of this menu, and it should also be on there. But for instance, in the primary teeth, see there's a quiz on characteristics, comparisons, and unique characteristics. Same way on the secondary teeth. You know, as we looked at earlier, here's 99 questions on that particular quiz. And then if we look at the unique characteristics, we've got 82 questions. And then there's the comparisons, because one of the things we hadn't talked about so far where you do get questions is primary versus secondary teeth. How do you tell a primary tooth from a secondary tooth? Well, here's a quiz that has 25 questions that cover that particular topic. And most of these they're easy, not meant to be challenging, but to emphasize the important points. So some of them are true and false or some multiple choice. And then calcification and eruption. There's 28 questions on the calcification and eruption. And then root morphology and pulp morphology, there's 67 questions. So in this calcification and, well, first of all, there's an endodontic section that has some very specific thing about all different aspects, three-dimensional models, resorption, canal preparation models, and different things specific to endodontics. The same thing with anthropology. And then there's a calcification and eruption. And this is a great test for students. You can take this and click on that. And then when you, there we go. Oops. My computer's a little slow today. So you can see that once you click on this and activate it, you can see the calcification and eruption of the teeth with the timeline that represents the average as presented by the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. And you can see that rotate around. Now, what's interesting about this, you see, you have the capability of stopping that at any point, print the screen, and what a great challenging question. I mean, that would challenge me to sit down and study that and figure out the approximate timeline. So you could do that as preferably a multiple choice question to make it a little easier for me to be able to handle this. But you can then rotate this around, and eventually it gets to the point where 11 years, and eventually, of course, you get to the full dentition. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then in here, there's all sorts of tables. For those people that get excited about tables, there it is. There are the dimensions of the primary dentition as presented by everybody that's ever published on that. And then we took the liberty of combining all the raw numbers from each of these particular authors, which may not be scientifically valid, and came up with a mean dimension, which is the average found by all of those authors for mesiodistal, incisal-cervical, facial-lingual, root length, and all the different characteristics. So again, secondary dentition, there you can see all of the tables about that, the dimensions at the cervical line, heights of contour, what did the author say about the heights of contour? So this, again, just a resource section. And then for those of you that use laboratory procedures, there's some videos in here. So in reality, you could actually have some students, if they were actually equipped at home, they could actually wax some teeth. I'm one of the people that believes it's still important to actually sit down and for students to form teeth, because that's how they really start getting their spatial abilities. And more important than that is they start developing fine motor skills by the applications of small amounts of wax. I hear different people say, well, no students are going to wax teeth after they graduate. True. not very many of them would do that. And we're not really trying to teach waxing. We're trying to teach spatial abilities and the development of fine motor skills. That to me is the reasons that we use wax because it's a convenient vehicle. So let me show you what's in here. This is my little discussion about the philosophy of the value of waxing teeth that some people don't believe in. And of course, I'm one of those that happens to believe that. So anyway, there's that information. And then we've had a series of teeth made by a company here in California. You can see the information. It's a set of 24 teeth. They're made by Viade Plastics. They cost about $30 in the US for this set of teeth. They're life-size teeth. They have the intact tooth and they have a missing portion of the tooth. And so I teach the students, hold the intact tooth next to the one that has a portion of it missing, and then start through a sequence. And we have an image series and videos that I made of actually me waxing the teeth so that people could see what it is. Now, that is preceded by an initial laboratory experience. One of our faculty many years ago fooled around, I would say, to figure out how would be a good way to introduce students to three-dimensional spatial abilities as well as flowing some wax. So let me just play this for you a little bit, and you'll see. For this waxing procedure, we will take the PKT #1 instrument, and I'll actually use the large diameter end of the instrument. We'll heat that in the Bunsen burner flame or electric some wax, one today, and then we'll flow this into the square recess #1 where we're going to carve it flush. Now you'll notice this block was made up in plastic. It has a square recess. It has another square recess that sits on top of a dome, and then it has a square depression. And the objective here is for the student to fill up this little square block, and then on the left one, carve the wax so it's perfectly smooth and flat with the perimeter surrounding surfaces. The second one, they're supposed to have a dome of wax that continues the contour of the plastic dome that's already there. And then the other one, obviously, is to teach them how to start carving occlusal anatomy, but also to start developing that three-dimensional perspective to be able to see things. So that's what really is going on here. And we want just a little bit extra wax. So if you look at that, you can see we have just a tiny bit of extra wax. Now let's fill the second box, which will be the convex surface. So there's a curve here in the plastic, and you follow that down into the wax. You do the next one, you just follow these grooves as they... And I'm just advancing in the interest of time here, just to give you an idea as to what it is that they would do. So in here, there are basically videos of all of the waxing of each of the teeth. So let me just show you quickly we start off with that little block, which could be given to the students, and they could actually do this. And let me show you for instance, let's go through the image series first of all. And I've termed this height to contour waxing technique. So let's say if they had and one of the teeth has the distal surface of the canine missing. So I have them first of all take a pencil, and on the intact canine, they draw a line that represents the heights of contour. So they can draw that in that direction, and then they can draw it incisal-cervically. And obviously, where those two lines cross each other, we now have the proximal contact identified. And then they can actually do measurements, because to begin with, they may not have developed the eye yet, and so they can do some measurements to determine where that should be. And this is then the example of the same tooth with the distal portion cut off as part of that set of teeth. So they could then take that, mark a dot. There's where I want the contact to be. They could draw the cervical line on there by comparing the two. And then they could add this loop of wax. so that it has the right location for the proximal contact as well as the proper distal extension. So I have them do that, and then they can follow the contour so it joins up with the facial and lingual surface. And so it looks kind of like that, instead of just putting a large lump of wax and carving it out, which, you know, those of us with some experience can do, but a student can't. I'm trying to have them concentrate on little bits at a time. And so they put that on, and then they start creating other little loops that represent the distofacial or the line angle, as you can see there. And then they fill that all in and they carve it until they get a completely formed wax tooth. And then I emphasize to them the importance of comparing that with the intact tooth to see what they like and little things that they would correct, and look at it from all different views to determine if that's the tooth that they would want to have. Now let's take a little more complicated tooth. So if we took a maxillary first molar, whoops, I think this one, the title there is the wrong title, but it's the right tooth. So again, they're going to take their intact maxillary first molar and, holding a pencil around it, draw a line around the perimeter so they can see the height of contour on that. And then the lingual half of this is cut off so they can draw a line. Now we've helped them by cutting this off, so the flat platform here is actually the same as the height of contour. It gives them a little bit of a clue. And then they do their little loop to make sure that the facial-lingual dimension is the same as the intact tooth. And then they'll carve that loop, fill it in mesially and distally, and then start looking at it. How does the external outline form compare with the intact tooth from different views? And then they'll put their mesiolingual and distolingual line angles in the tooth going down, and then fill that in. And now they have the tooth finished. And then they can start figuring out, where do I want the cusps to be located? So they can make measurements from the cervical line if they want to. And as it turns out, this particular tooth was formed with the same dimension between the different cusp tips, as you can see here. So it really is helpful for the students. And they can carve that flat, and then they can build the cones like we've traditionally taught waxing for many, many years. And I tell them, you know, you're going to struggle a little bit to make a cone probably as symmetrical as what we've shown here, but they've got little dots where they're projecting that the cones be placed. And they look at all those cones from many different views to be sure they like where they have positioned those. And then on the intact tooth, I have them draw the outline form of the heights of contour on the occlusal surface, or the outline of the so-called occlusal table. And then they start forming the little loops that become the cusp ridges and continuation of the marginal ridges. And then they fill in the lingual surface, fill in the occlusal aspect, and then start doing their carving. They can add a little cuspa carabelli to make it a little bit more elegant. And they can go through this particular process. Now, to be honest, I've never tried having students do this at home by themselves. It'd be a very interesting experiment to do if they had the proper setup, to see if they could take these pictures and actually wax the teeth to a proper form. But anyway, that is in here. So that takes us through the tooth atlas and its different parts. And again, this part would be what the students would be studying from and absolutely having to know. And then they could look at this interactive course that's a recording of my shrunken head along with some information, and then they can answer the questions as they pop up, which is a good review session. And then they have all the specialized quizzes and resources for different faculty to use and develop the course. And again, back to the tooth morphology, that's the student's resource and your resource for teaching. Now, what I've found works best, of course, is if each of the students has a copy of this in their computer, and then you select what you want them to do as the expert in your particular institution. And that's how it's worked well for me. So I hope that this has been a beneficial session for you in terms of what's in this program and how you could use it for the upcoming online, because we're going to be into this for at least the foreseeable future. Our schools, we're committed to at least up until summer teaching everything online, and it depends on the virus situation as to whether we extend beyond that. I'm also convinced that once people start doing more online, because we've had to do it, we have no choice, that there'll probably be a greater use of this in the future, because we're all going to become much more familiar with the technology. I mean, I'm still learning how to use the technology myself in teaching. So tomorrow, I'm going to do the same type of tutorial showing the eHuman program on removable partial dentures and complete dentures for anybody that wants to see that and how that could be used. This particular program, the 3D Tooth Atlas, is the most highly developed of all of the eHuman programs, because it's been around for the longest times, and that's why it has all these examinations. Those other two programs do not have examinations built into them, but they are very effective in using, and I'll show how to use that at that point tomorrow. So I thank you for everybody attending, and hopefully you've gotten some good ideas. My email is cgoodacre, CGOODACRE, cgoodacre at LLU, Loma Linda University.edu. So that's CGOODACRE at LLU.edu. And then eHuman, I believe, has the tutorial available. I've actually written out a document that gives you some ideas of where specific portions of content are located that I would be using in a classroom setting or online. I forgot to ask them if they've put that on there. So I know Roz Brown is on this. So Roz, you respond to all the attendees. You know, that little tutorial that I've made up for each of the programs that shows them gives them some idea. If you want to talk about this, here's where it's located in the program, so that they could email you and be able to get a copy of that. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great remainder of the day. Stay healthy and safe.
Thank you.